Remix is an amazing framework that builds up on React that vastly simplifies the process of building full-stack React applications where you seamlessly blend front-end and back-end code. In this Remix Essentials crash course here, you're going to get started with Remix and all its core features. And if you then want to dive deeper, if you also want to learn about adding authentication with Remix, if you want to build a complete demo project, another demo project besides the one we'll build in this crash course here, and if you simply want to learn more about this amazing framework, you also might want to check out my complete Remix course which I have, Remix the Practical Guide, to which you find a link with a great discount below this video. But with that, let's now dive back into this course here and let's take a closer look at Remix and what it is. So what is Remix? Well, it is a framework for React.js. And that, of course, brings up one important question. Isn't React.js already a library? Yes, it of course is. React.js is a JavaScript library for building user interfaces, highly reactive user interfaces, to be precise. So why do we need Remix then? Well, Remix builds up on top of React.js, so you will still write React code, but Remix adds a lot of extra features that simplify the process of building full-stack applications with React. Because if you're using just React, if you have a normal React project, like I have it here in this front-end folder, then you have a lot of code that deals with displaying a user interface. However, if that application also needs a backend where you, for example, store data in a database, you must add code to that React application that sends requests to that backend, to that separate backend server, which then runs some server-side code that does actually talk to the database. So in your front-end React application, you have code for sending requests, for managing some loading state whilst the request is on its way, so that you, for example, can show some loading spinner or some loading display, and for handling any potential errors that might be sent back. That's what you do on the front end. And as mentioned, what you need then is a separate backend if you want to build a full stack application. So that's a totally different project, for example, built with Node and Express.js, but you could build it with any programming language. And there you then do the actual work of reaching out to a database or to a file or wherever you're storing your data. You could build such a backend yourself, or you're using some third-party service like Firebase. But either way, you have a detached, separate backend. That's how you normally build full-stack applications when using React for the front-end. And it's really important to understand and keep in mind that in your front-end application, in the React app you're building, you're not directly talking to some database or anything like that. Instead, you're sending requests to the separate backend. Now, that request sending is often done with useEffect, which wraps the code for sending such a fetch request, for example. Or if you're using the latest version of React Router, you could also use the new API offered by React Router for adding loaders and actions for sending requests when a route becomes active, for example. You still have a separate backend with that, but the React code you have to write gets much easier and leaner. But I do cover React Router in my full React course and also in a separate video which I created for my YouTube channel. Either way, you have a detached backend. Now, if you're using Remix instead, and of course you'll learn how to create Remix projects and which features Remix offers throughout this course, but if you're using Remix, then these things change. You still build a React application, you still have a React component, you still write React code, but you blend your server-side code into the same file where you define your components. So you have a mixture of front-end and back-end code in the same file. The code here might look similar to what you saw with React Router, since I also have such a loader and such an action function here, but here we then actually have code that runs on the server, some backend code. And therefore, of course, building a full stack React application becomes much easier because you have one project and backend and frontend code work together seamlessly. And Remix, this framework, automatically splits your code such that only the frontend code is served to your users, so they never see your backend code, which could also contain sensible data, for example. And on the other hand, the backend code is executed on a server. As a side effect that must not be underestimated, the users of your website, so the visitors of your website, also receive the finished website when visiting your website. So they get the finished HTML page with all the data already injected into the page, which also helps a lot with search engine optimization, since those search engine crawlers see the full website, including all the data that makes up that website, instead of just seeing the empty skeleton that is yet to be populated by React, by the client-side code that is yet to execute after the first version of the page has been loaded. So that's a major advantage you get when using Remix, because Remix pre-renders all these components and all these pages on the server and then serves the finished page to your end users. So that's what Remix is and why you might want to use it. It simplifies the process of building full-stack React application by merging the code bases, and it gives you many advantages. And Remix has a couple of other amazing features, and to be honest, writing Remix code and building Remix apps simply is a lot of fun, because it's such an amazing framework. Now, in the last lecture, you learned what Remix is and why you might want to use it. Now, maybe what you learned there sounds familiar to you. There is another framework for React called Next.js, which kind of aims to solve the same problems, which also helps with building full stack applications, and indeed I do have a full course about Next.js as well. But there are some important differences between Remix and Next.js. For example, with Remix, you always render all pages on the server. So whenever a user enters a URL leading to your page, that page that's being served is rendered on the server on the fly. So the user always gets the latest data and a brand new page. Of course, you can set up some caching if you want to, but generally it is rendered when a user visits the site. With Next.js, you can write some code that forces a page component to be rendered for every request, but that's just optional because in most cases, you write code where the site is statically generated at build time, so right before deployment. With Remix, this is not supported. With Next.js, it's basically the standard or the default for many pages. Therefore, for Remix, if you want to deploy it, you always need a host, a server that supports server-side code execution. With Next.js, that's not necessarily the case, because there, if you pre-rendered all pages at build time, you only need a static host. You only need a host that's capable of server-side code execution for Next.js if you're using this optional feature of rendering certain pages on the server on the fly. But these are just some technical differences. There also are many syntax differences, and even though I really like Next.js and it is absolutely amazing, I think that Remix has an even nicer API and that building Remix apps is even more fun than it is to build Next.js apps, which still is awesome, don't get me wrong, but Remix is maybe more awesome. We'll see after taking this course. So now, after learning what Remix is and why we might want to use it, and after understanding what this course is about, it's really time to get started with Remix, and that's exactly what we'll do in this section now. We'll dive into the crucial, core, fundamental Remix features you must know to build any kind of Remix app. And for that, of course, we're first of all going to create a new Remix application. We're then going to explore the files that were created, and we're going to learn about routing and how we can configure different routes and support different URL paths in our Remix app. We're also, of course, going to dive into the super important topic of data fetching and manipulation, since that's one of the main advantages of Remix, if you want to put it like that, because that's what defines basically any full stack application, that you store data in some data source and you get data from some data source. But we're not going to stop there. In this essentials section here, we're also going to learn how we can style, our Remix application, how we can make it look good, how we can handle metadata. And after this section, you will therefore have a solid understanding of what it takes to build a Remix app and how it generally works. Thereafter, in subsequent course sections, we're of course going to dive even deeper into Remix, explore these features in greater detail, and also dive into advanced features. But for now, let's get started with Remix. Now, to get started with building a Remix application, we must create a new Remix project. And we do that with a command we execute in the command line, in the terminal. And it does not matter which operating system you're using, the command is always the same, and you always build Remix applications in the same way. Now, for this command, which we're about to execute, you must have Node.js installed. And in general, you must have Node.js installed because the Remix code we write also includes Node.js features. Therefore, you should visit nodejs.org, and there you can download this latest Node.js version. In my case, it's version 19, but you should simply download the latest version you're seeing when you're viewing this. And if that's a later version, that's perfectly fine. What you will learn in this course will still apply. Now, after installing Node.js, back in the terminal or command prompt, you're ready to run the command to create a new Remix project. And that command is npx, which is a command made available by Node.js, create-remix. And then, to be safe that you're using the latest version of this Remix project creation tool, you should add @latest thereafter. Now make sure, by the way, that you're running this command in a folder where you want to create your Remix project. So you should navigate into such a folder in the terminal, in the command prompt, before running that command. Then simply hit enter, and this will now take a short while until it gets started, and then it will ask you a couple of questions. For example, you must define the name of the project folder that will hold the actual Remix project that is about to be created. And here I'll name it remix-course, and this will create a new folder called remix-course in the location where I'm currently at here in the terminal. After hitting enter, we then can choose whether we want a basic project or some pre-configured stack with more features already added in, and we'll stick to the basics here. Then we have to choose where we want to deploy this app, though we can always change this later, and I will come back to this question later in the course when we do talk about deploying Remix applications. To get started and for this course, you should stick to Remix app server here. Thereafter, you can choose whether you want to use TypeScript or JavaScript, and even though Remix is awesome with TypeScript, I'll stick to JavaScript here since, of course, not every student watching this course knows TypeScript. And the general code you write is, of course, always the same, no matter if you're using JavaScript or TypeScript. It's just the type annotations that are missing with JavaScript. So here JavaScript it is, and then I'll choose yes to make sure that npm install is ran thereafter. And now this project is created and all required dependencies are installed automatically. Now let's wait for that to finish here. And once the installation finished and the project was therefore created, you can open it with your favorite code editor. In my case, that's Visual Studio Code, but you can use any code editor you want. And with that project created, it's now time to take a closer look at all these files and folders that were created, so that we understand what we got here. So what do we have in this brand new Remix project? Well, we got a bunch of configuration files on the root level here. A Remix configuration file where we can set various Remix settings, and I'll get back to some of these settings later in the course once we prepare our application for deployment. Right now, the default settings are fine. We then get the package.json file, which contains a list of all the dependencies that are installed into this project. Right now, as you can see, it's basically a bunch of Remix dependencies and, of course, React. Since we're still building a React app here, just a full stack React app, of course. And then we got various scripts which we can execute to, for example, build this project for production, to start the production server, or very important for us for the majority of this course, this dev script here, which allows us to start a development server, which allows us to preview the app whilst we're building it. We then got a JS config file and a ESLint config file with further settings for the code editor we're using and for how this project is being built. But all the default settings are fine here for us. And therefore it's now these folders which are interesting to us. Now node modules, as always, contains all the dependencies of this project, and you should not edit anything in that folder. You can also delete this folder and always bring it back by running npm install, of course. This will then install all dependencies listed in package.json and recreate node modules with it. But the public and app folder, these are the interesting folders for us. Now the public folder simply contains any static assets your application might require. For example, any images you want to serve in your application could be put into this public folder. But it's the app folder that's most interesting, because you'll spend the vast majority of your time in that folder. Because in that folder, you define your React components you want to use and your routes, your pages you want to support in this full stack application. So that users can, for example, visit mydomain.com/nothing and mydomain.com/news or anything like that. That will be defined here in this routes subfolder, and that's something I will of course come back to later in this section. Now regarding the files we have here, the root.jsx file is a very important file. This is basically the root component that's always rendered no matter which route, so which specific page is loaded thereafter. Now I'll get back to some of these components we have in this file a little bit later, but essentially that's the skeleton, the wrapper that's wrapped around any page content that you will define for your different pages that make up this application. You can also set up some general metadata here, though as you will learn later in the course, you can also customize this metadata for different pages. But that's essentially the skeleton that will be used for any page that makes up your overall application, your overall full stack website here. We then got two entry files here, which essentially define the code that will be executed for every request that reaches the server. And you can edit this code if you want to run some extra code for every incoming request, but unless you have clear plans what you want to do there, you should stick to the default code you get out of the box. And the entry client.jsx file basically contains the code, the JavaScript code that's executed on the client, so in the browser after the page was loaded there. And here you should also basically keep the default which you see here, unless you know what you're doing. So these files aren't too interesting for us right now. I will get back to root.jsx later, but for the moment, let's take a closer look at these routes. So what's the idea behind the routes folder in this app folder? Well, as mentioned before, in there, we basically define the different routes, so the different pages we want to support as part of our overall web application, of our overall website, you could say. And we start with one single file in there right now, the index.jsx file, which basically is our homepage, the starting page of this website. Now we got some dummy content in there, and the exact content might change over time. So when you create a new remix project, this content might be different. But that's not too important, because I'm going to delete all this content here anyways, and instead add a single h1 element and say hello world. Now please note that this here in the end is a regular React component function. It's a function that returns JSX code. That is the definition of a React component function essentially. It's exported as a default and, that's the important part, it's stored in a file in the routes folder. And any files you put into this routes folder will be treated as separate routes by Remix. So where with React Router, if you're using that package in a regular React app, so in a non-Remix app, you have to define your routes, for example, with create browser router. You instead define routes by creating separate files, one for every route, in that routes folder in the app folder. Now, index is a special file name, which here defines the starting page of this overall website. But I could add a second file here, for example, demo.jsx, and then in there, export another default function called demo page, for example. The name of this component function does not matter. Where I return h1 demo page. So where I also output a title that contains the text demo page. With that, I would have created a second route, a second page basically, on this overall website, besides this starting page. Now to see this in action, we should open the terminal again, and here I'm using the one integrated into Visual Studio Code, but it's my default terminal still. And I'll run npm run dev. And that's this dev server executed with help of this dev script, which I mentioned before. If we run this, a development server will start up on the URL you see here. And if you visit this URL, you see your website. And out of the box, we of course end up on the starting page of this website. Therefore, here, if I zoom in a bit, we see Hello World. And we see Hello World because that's of course the content of this starting page route. Now, if I do edit this URL though, and I add /demo thereafter, I end up on this demo page. I end up there because I entered demo here, /demo. So demo is the path I added to my domain here. And since I named this file here, demo.jsx, this loads this component here. Now, if I would enter any other name here, like ABC, I get an error, a 404 error to be precise, because I haven't defined any file with the name ABC in my routes folder. So these file names matter. They define for which path a certain route is loaded, and index is a special file name representing the starting page here. But that's how routing generally works with Remix. Now, when it comes to routing and defining routes, Remix has way more to offer than what we saw here. It's not just about adding files that represent the paths which we can add after our domain, but this is one of the most important features. Now, for a start here, what I want to do is I want to make sure that we can switch between these routes, not just by manually entering different URLs here in the URL address bar of the browser, but by instead offering a link which I can click. And I'll start on this starting page. Here we could wrap this h1 element into a fragment with this special fragment component, which is a default React component offered by React, has nothing to do with Remix. And then below that we could add a link by adding an anchor element here and say go to demo page as a caption, and then add the ref attribute which points at /demo. That's how we could add a link. Now, if we do that, we can save that, of course, go back to the starting page, and we see the link here. If I click the link, it also works. I go to this demo page. But there's a small gotcha here. If you watch this refresh icon here, you'll see that as I click this link, watch this icon, it briefly changes to a cross, which indicates that a new request was sent and that we actually downloaded a new file. We can also confirm this behavior by opening the developer tools, and there going to the network tab. Here, if I click on go to demo page, we see that a bunch of requests were sent. Most importantly, one request for the demo page HTML file, which was received as a response. Now, this has a couple of important implications. If we take a look at this response, we see that it indeed is a brand new HTML file that contains the content of this demo page. That's great for search engine optimization, for example, because it means that we really downloaded a new finished HTML file. But the disadvantage of this is that we did send a new request. Now, it would be nice if we're already on this page if we could just navigate to a different page with client-side JavaScript only. So if we enter a URL manually, it would be nice if we download the finished HTML code. But if we are on the website already, just on a different page, and we then click a link, it would be great if the next page would be loaded by using the client-side JavaScript code, fetching any data that might be needed maybe behind the scenes, and otherwise not sending a new request. Because that saves us from downloading all the JavaScript code that makes up our application again. Because with Remix, you of course still have client-side JavaScript code, even though you are pre-rendering pages on the server on the fly. But you still build a React application where you, of course, also still have client-side JavaScript code, for example, to handle user input or react to button clicks or do whatever you want to do. And to make sure that we're not leaving this page and we're refetching everything when we click a link, we should not use this default anchor element, but instead a special component offered by Remix. And that component is imported from @remix/react, and it's the link component. Now, this link component is a component you of course might know from React Router, which by the way is a package developed by the same team that built Remix. But here we're not importing it from React Router, but instead from @remixrun/react. Now, if we use this link instead of the anchor element, and we replace the ref attribute with the to prop, then you'll see that if I save everything and I go back to the starting page, I still have the link here, but if you watch this refresh icon again as I click it, it does not turn to a cross. And if I open the developer tools, you will see that if I click this link, there is just one request for the fav icon here, but no other requests being sent. So now we don't re-download everything, but we instead stay on the page on which we already were. So we get the best of both worlds. New visitors that enter a URL or click a link on some other website, download the finished HTML files as they reach our website. But users that are already on the website stay on that site and basically get a single page application again after sending this first request when they first visited the website. So we added these two routes here. Of course, they're not too exciting, and therefore now I want to switch to a more exciting project on which will work for the rest of this section here. This is what the finished project will look like. We'll be able to take nodes, view the nodes, navigate to the node details, and we'll also add a bunch of features which are not directly visible here in the end result. But in order to get there, back here in the project, I'll start by deleting this demo.jsx file, and we'll also change the content of the index file here of this starting page, which we have here. For that, attached you find a new index.jsx file, which you should use to replace yours with. So your index.jsx file should have this file content after replacing it. And as you see in there, I got a couple of elements, some standard HTML elements supported by React. I got some IDs on some elements which will become important later for styling. At the moment, they serve no purpose. And I get a link leading to /nodes. And of course, that's a route we're not currently supporting. There is no nodes.jsx file. But I want to have one because that will be the page where we will be able to add new nodes and see a list of our nodes. Therefore, as a next step, you should add a nodes.jsx file in your routes folder to register this new route, which will be reached whenever someone visits /nodes. So in our case, localhost 3000 /nodes, but of course, localhost 3000 will later be whichever domain you chose for your website. So that's the next file we add. Now in this nodes.jsx file here, we should export a new function as the default for this file. And this function can be named nodes page. Again, the function name isn't too important, though it will appear in error or debug messages you might see if things go wrong. Now in this nodes page component function, I want to return some JSX code because this should be a React component function here. And here to get started, I'll return the default main element, and then in there a h1 element where I simply say my nodes. Now we'll refine this page later, we'll tweak it later, but for the moment that's what I'll output here. With that, if you save that and you start your development server again with npm run dev, you will not find /demo anymore, but you should be able to visit localhost 3000 and see your starting page content. And keep in mind, I'm zoomed in quite a bit here, that's why it's that huge for me here. And then here I got this link which leads me to the nodes page. Of course, it's super ugly right now, but we'll get there. This is an important first step. Now, since it's quite ugly though, as a next step, I want to add some styling to these pages. And how do we add styling in Remix apps? Well, you get various options. You can, for example, use popular CSS libraries like Tailwind. And you actually find a guide on using Tailwind with Remix on the official Remix documentation. In that documentation article, to which you also find a link attached to this video, you also learn more about various styling options, but of course I'll also go through the most important styling options together with you over the next minutes. And for this course, I'll stick to vanilla CSS, though no worries, you don't have to write the CSS code, I will provide it to you. But I'm doing this so that we don't have some extra dependency on some totally independent and not Remix-related CSS library. Now to get started, attached to this lecture, you find a main.css file which contains some styling I want to apply to this page. But where should this file be stored? Well, it generally is up to you, but I prefer to create a new folder in the app folder, which I name styles. Though unlike routes, styles is not a reserved name. The routes folder must be named routes because Remix will look for route files in that routes folder. But the styles folder does not have to be named styles because we will manually point at the style files we add there. So therefore you can put the main.css file, which you find attached to this lecture, into this styles folder so that it's in there. Now in that main.css file, I'm defining some CSS variables, some colors which I'm basically using, and then I'm setting up some fonts, some background colors, and some styles, for example, for the main and navigation, which we'll add soon. So some styles which will be used throughout this section. And if you add this file and you reload, nothing changes. Well, because as I just mentioned, Remix does not automatically look for such a styles folder. It doesn't expect a styles folder. This name is up to you. If you have some styles that should be applied to your page, you have to tell Remix about it. And you do tell Remix about styles you want to apply by adding special functions to your route files. Here, main CSS actually contains some styles that will affect all my pages, and therefore instead of adding it to all my route files separately, which would be a lot of redundant work, I'll add it to this root.jsx file. I mentioned before that root.jsx defines basically the main skeleton that will be wrapped around all your page components. To be precise, your page components, like this markup returned by nodes page, will be injected in this outlet place here. So this outlet marker here in this root skeleton will be replaced with the actual content returned by your page components. That's how that works. So this is the root page, the root component that wraps all my other page components. And therefore in this root.jsx file, we can export a special function, and we must export a special function. And that function should be called links. Now that's a reserved name. Remix will be looking for an exported function called links. It looks for such a function in all your route files, and the root file, the root.jsx file, counts as a route file. This is your root route that wraps all other routes, so to say. Now you don't have to export a links function. Remix works without it as well, as you saw before. But you do need this function if you want to add some extra links that should be added in the head section of your HTML document. Because you might notice that this skeleton does not just define the marker where the actual page content will be injected, but also some other components. These are some utility components for getting live reload during development, for restoring the scroll bar position if users navigate between pages, and for injecting the client-side scripts when the page is downloaded on the client side. But we also got these components in the head section, which are used by Remix to inject any metadata or any links that apply to pages. And with links, I mean link elements like this one. That's how we could point at a style sheet in a regular HTML document. And instead of adding link here, we add our links with that links function. This function, if you add it, should return an array. And in that array, you have various objects, where every object defines one link that will be injected in this links place here by Remix when it renders your page. Here you add all the attributes you would add on this link element as properties in this object. So here I add the rel property and set it to style sheet, as I would have added the rel attribute with a value of style sheet to the link element I could have added here. And then I add another property called ref, which points at the style sheet that should be loaded. And now here's a special twist. You do actually import your style sheets into your JavaScript files like this. You add a new import statement in your file where you want to import it. Then you give it any name of your choice, like styles. And then you point at the file that should be imported. Here we can point at /styles, ./styles to be precise, to create a relative path, and then main.css. By the way, you can also use the tilde symbol here. That's a special alias which you can use in your import statements, and it will always refer to your app folder. So this is looking for a styles folder in your app folder, which is a folder that exists. So this will import my styles, and now it's these styles which we use as a value for ref here. This dynamically creates a link to this style file, which can be loaded by the browser. And that's how you should register your links. Now this might look rather cumbersome compared to simply adding a link here, but we do this because, as I mentioned before, all your page components can register links and can define links, page-specific links. Now here we have one in the root page that should apply to all pages, which is why we are adding it here, but we could also export links in index.jsx or nodes.jsx. And indeed, that's what I'll do. I add another CSS file, which you also find attached, home.css, to my styles folder. And this file contains some styles that apply only to the content of the index.jsx file. The IDs content and CTA can be found here for styling purposes in home.css. Now in this index.jsx file in the routes folder, we can also export this links function. And there we also return an array where we have an object with a property rel with a value of style sheet, and then another property called ref. And we then import the home styles, or however we want to call this, from tilde/styles/home.css. And then it's my home styles, which are registered here. Now we're defining some links that only apply to this page. And again, Remix will automatically create the link tags and inject them in the head section when this page is loaded. Now we have this page-specific approach here, where you can define page-specific links so that users don't unnecessarily download CSS files if they don't need them. If a user is on the nodes page, they don't need the styles for the starting page. That's why you can define your links to download style files, for example, on a per page level. Well, and with these adjustments made, you already see that we got a different look here. Now, of course, you can tweak it. It's up to you whether you like that look, but we got a new look. If I click on try now, we see that for the nodes page, we got this general background, which is defined here in main CSS, which is loaded for all pages since we exported in root, but we got no page specific looks here. That's only the case here for the starting page. And that's how we can generally style our pages. Now, when it comes to styling, there's one last aspect of styling which I want to show you and which I want to talk about. Let's say on this nodes page, we finally want to add more meaningful content. For that, attached you find a React component, a component which we'll not use as a route, as a page, but as a regular component that we use as part of other components. To be precise, the attached component should be used here in this nodes page component. For that, attached you find a new node.jsx file and a new node.css file. Now I'll add a new folder in my app folder called components, though this name is also up to you. It doesn't have to be components. It could be any name of your choice. Remix will not be looking for it. But it makes sense to name it components because I'll store all my non-page components, all my non-page React components in there. So the attached new node.jsx file and CSS files go in there. Now, if you take a look at this new node component file, you see that in there we got a form. This form will become important later for adding new nodes. At the moment, we can ignore the content, and as you see, it's also not too exciting. It's really just that form with some inputs. And then we get some styles for this form and the inputs. Now I want to use this new node component in this nodes.jsx file. And there it should be used instead of this h1 element. To do that, we first of all have to import this newly added component into this nodes.jsx file. So we import new node from, and then we can use the tilde symbol to get our quick access to the app folder, and then access /components/new node. You can omit the file extension. And then here we can use new node as a component, like we do it in any other React app as well. There's nothing Remix specific about this code here. It's a standard React component using another React component which is imported. Now, if you save that, you'll notice that the form is visible, but of course not styled, not looking good. Now, to apply that styling here, we have to expose this style file via links. Now, for doing that, we got a couple of options. We can go to our nodes.jsx file, to this route file, and for example, not just import the new node component from the new node.jsx file, but also import the new node styles from /components new node.css. And here you need the file extension. You do need it for .css files. You can only omit it for JavaScript and JSX files. Now with that imported, we can of course export this links function as we did before, return that array, and make our style sheet available here like this. That's what we did before. And if we do that, we got the styling applied. So that works, and that is a perfectly fine way of doing it. Now there is an alternative approach though, so that you don't have to add this extra CSS import here in your route component file. We could go to the new node.jsx file, and we could import this styles file from here. Now, of course, we still import the new node.css file in the end, but it might make more sense to do it here in the new node.jsx file, which sits next to this CSS file. With those styles imported here, we could then export them from this new node.jsx file. To be precise, we could export a links function here as well. And that function has the same shape as it does in my route files. So I add rel style sheet and then ref styles. Styles is the name I chose here for the import. So I added this links function to this component. Now, the problem is Remix will not be looking for links functions or any other route component specific functions in files that are not route files. And since this is a regular component file, not in the route folder, Remix will ignore this links function. But of course, we can use it. In this nodes.jsx file, we can add more than just the new node component function from the new node.jsx file. We can also import this links function, which we export. And we could give it an alias, maybe new node links. And now here in the links which we return for the nodes page, we could simply merge in all links of any components that we might be using. So we execute new node links here, this function which we're importing from new node. And this function returns an array. And then I use the spread operator to merge the array items into this array returned by this links function in this route component file. This is a pattern called surfacing links, and it is actually a pattern that's also mentioned and explained in the official Remix documentation, which is why I'm also mentioning it here. It is some extra work, but it makes sure that you can use one consistent API for making your style files available. One thing I want to mention though, which is really important, is that those styles defined in this new node CSS file will not be scoped to this component. They are still global styles. If you are defining some class in here, like form actions, which I am, and you're using that class in some other component that's part of that same page as well, those styles would be applied and would potentially clash with other styles. We're not using CSS modules here. We got no scoped styles. So we have some component-specific styles, kind of, but they're technically still global. It still makes sense to manage them in a separate CSS file, which might be kept close to the JSX file, so that maintaining this component and its styles is as easy as possible. Ultimately, it is of course up to you which approach you prefer. If you want to surface styles like this, if you want to put everything into one global style file, which is then stored in the styles folder and maybe then imported into root.jsx, or if you want to import style files into your route page components and then use this links function. It is up to you. I'll stick to this surfacing approach here, but I wanted to show you these different approaches so that you can choose your personal favorite. Now, with styling out of the way, before we dive deeper into more Remix features and we especially dive into data fetching and mutation, I want to add one other new component to this page, and that's a main navigation bar component. For this, attached you find a main navigation.jsx file, which you should store in this components folder. Because this again is not a standalone route component, but it instead is a component we'll use inside of other components. Now, if you take a look at the code of this component, you'll notice one new component which you might have not seen before. The navlink component, which is imported from Remix Run React. I'm using it basically like the normal link component, which you saw and used before. But navlink has one special feature. The link that's currently active receives an active CSS class. And that class can be used for giving that link a special style. And indeed in main CSS, which we added earlier already, I got some main navigation styles and also a special style for anchor tags in the main navigation that do have this special active class. This simply makes it easier for users to see which link in the main navigation led them to the currently active page. Now we just have to use this main navigation component. And I of course want to make sure that it's visible on every page of our website. For that we could of course go to our different routes and add this main navigation component in every page component. But that would be rather cumbersome. Here we of course only have 2 routes, only 2 pages, but in bigger applications you easily have dozens or maybe even hundreds of pages. And you don't want to start adding shared components manually to all these pages. Instead, it's again the root component that we can leverage here. Because as mentioned before, this skeleton is wrapped around all our pages and therefore it's the perfect place for shared components like this main navigation. Hence here in my body, I'll add a header, the standard header element, and then add my main navigation here. For that, we just need to import this component, and therefore here, at the top of this file, I'll import main navigation from ~/components, and then there, main navigation. That makes this component available in the root.jsx file, and I'm then using it like this here in my body, above the outlet, so above the place where the page component content will be injected. With that, if we save this, we got this navigation bar at the top here, and you see that the active link is highlighted because it does receive this special active CSS class, which is applied here because we're using navlink instead of link. With the main navigation added and our website finally taking some shape here, it's time to make sure that we can actually create nodes here and submit those nodes, that we do something on the backend, because we're all here to build full stack applications in the end, because I mentioned that this is what Remix would be all about, and right now there's nothing full stackish about this application as we have absolutely no server-side code in there. We just have some React components, and we're doing some routing, which we could be doing on the client side with React Router as well. Well, now we're going to change things. In the new node.jsx files, we already got a form, which will be submitted when this button is clicked. And if you've worked with just React in the past, you often added a submit handler here on submit. You added a handler like this, submit handler, and you pointed at this handler here. And then you got an event here, and you typically called event.preventDefault. Now, if you have used React Router version 6.4 or higher, chances are you've not been doing this, because with that version of React Router, some new APIs were introduced that actually let you handle form submissions in a more elegant way. And I do have a separate video about that, and I do of course also cover this in my complete guide React course. But here, we're not going to use React Router because we're using Remix, and we're not going to add a submit handler like this. We're not going to prevent the default. Instead, with Remix, we're going to embrace the default. And how do we do that? Well, this form has a method, and we're therefore going to send a post request whenever this form is submitted. Now, if you have worked with HTML form elements before, you might know that you can also add the action attribute here. This enables you to define a path to which this post request should be sent when this form is submitted. And by the way, the form will be submitted whenever this button is clicked. A default button in a form submits the form. Here, you can define the path the post request should be sent to, and we could use nodes here to send it to this nodes page here, to this nodes route. And soon we'll add some code here that actually handles the form submission. But we actually don't have to add the action here, because this new node component is already used by this page component defined for this nodes route. We're using new node here. And therefore, this new node form will actually be loaded for /nodes, so for this nodes route. And if you then submit a form, it will by default send the request to the path that's currently active, so to /nodes if this form is rendered on the /nodes route, which will be the case since we use that new node component in this nodes page. So therefore here, this form would by default create a request that's sent to /nodes. And we can see this in action. If we go back to our page here, and we open the developer tools and the network tab, and we enter some content here and click add node, it will crash right now, but what you'll see is that here in the network tab, it actually tried to send a request to nodes. And it was a post request sent to localhost 3000/nodes. Now it failed because currently we have no code handling this post request, but it did do the right thing. It tried to send that request. So therefore now we just have to add some code to this nodes route to handle that request which currently fails. And that's exactly where we'll start building a full stack application now. Because now we have to add a new function here to this nodes.jsx file, and we have to export it, and this function must be called action. This is a name Remix will be looking for, just as it was looking for links. And indeed, there are a couple of special functions which you can export in your route files Remix will be looking for, and action is one of them. And you might know this action function if you have worked with React Router version 6.4 or higher, but this action here in this Remix app will work differently. Because with React Router, we had some client-side code that would be executed upon form submissions. Now we'll have some backend code. Whatever we put into this action function will run on the backend, on the server, not in the browser. And the code defined in this action function therefore will also not be downloaded to the client. Remix will split the code and only execute and store that code in this action function on the server. But when exactly is this action function triggered? Well, it is triggered whenever a non-GET request reaches this route. If a GET request reaches /nodes, it's simply the component that's returned, so this page component. And a GET request is, for example, sent if we just enter /nodes and we hit enter here, or if we click a link that leads to /nodes. If a non-GET request reaches this route, like a post request, which is what we're sending here from this form, then it's actually the action function that will be triggered instead of the component function. And here in this action function, we can then execute our server-side code that extracts the submitted data and maybe stores it in a database or in a file or whatever you want to do. For that attached, you find a nodes.js file, and in the app folder, you should add a new data folder. This folder name again is totally up to you and not reserved, but I'll put my nodes.js file, which is attached to this lecture, into this data folder. Now in this nodes.js file, I just got some utility functions for reading data from a file and for storing data in a file, in a nodes.json file to be precise. Now we could be interacting with a database here, and in most apps you probably will, but to keep things simple here, we'll just use this file as a storage, because it doesn't really matter what we use here, the remix code is not affected by that. Now we just have to add a nodes.json file here on the root level of this project, so next to the package.json file. And this nodes.json file will receive an empty object, if you want to call it like this, where I add nodes, which is an empty array initially. Now this is the JSON file format here, and we should have this initial structure in nodes.json. Now with that added, back in nodes.jsx, we can interact with this nodes.json file with help of these utility methods stored in nodes.js in the data folder. And that is indeed exactly what we'll do over the next minutes. Now what do we want to do here in action? Of course we want to get the data entered into this form and then store it as a new node in this nodes.json file with help of these utility methods here. For that, we first of all need to extract the data submitted by that form. And thankfully, that's super easy. If you're using a form as we're doing it here, then the browser, out of the box, takes all the inputs that are in the form and puts them into an object which is attached to the outgoing post request. The browser does this for you. You don't have to do it manually. It will not be in JSON format but some other format, but that does not matter here. The outgoing post request will include all the input data. Now you will be able to extract the input data with help of these names that you assigned to your inputs and text areas and whatever you have in your forms. So you must have the name attribute on your inputs, and then these name values are of course up to you. Here I chose title and content. So we don't have to extract any values in our client-side React code. We don't have to use two-way binding or refs. We just submit a form and we have these names on our input elements. And then here in the action, we actually get an object provided by Remix, because Remix is the thing calling this action function, and Remix gives us a data object that includes various pieces of information. Most importantly, this data object includes a request object with details about the request that was submitted by the form. And here I'll simply use object destructuring to directly get access to that request object like this. Now this request object has a form data method which we can execute. This actually returns a promise, and to use async await here, I'll add the async keyword in front of this function, which is okay. This action function can be an async function or a non-async function. It does not matter. And I'll then await calling request form data. The result is a form data object, which actually gives us access to the input values that were entered into these form inputs. So that's how we can extract that submitted data from the incoming request. And we're embracing a lot of web standards here. The standard request object that's constructed by the browser and sent to the backend, and the standard form behavior that's built into browsers. We don't reinvent the wheel by writing our own logic. Instead, we embrace these standards and we get access to all this submitted data with one simple line of code here on the backend. And keep in mind, this is on the backend here since it's in the action function. Now that's the first step. As a next step, I'll add a node data object, a brand new JavaScript object, where I add a title property, and then we can access this form data object here, which we got by calling form data like this. And there we can call the special get method to extract our values by the name we assigned to the input elements. So here, since I used title and content as names for my input elements, I can use title for extracting the title and content for extracting the content. And I store these extracted values in this object. Alternatively, there is a shortcut. You can use the built-in object object with a capital O at the beginning and call from entries and pass your form data object to it. This will basically convert this form data object, which would require the use of methods to extract the data that's submitted, into a standard plain JavaScript object. And this JavaScript object will have a title and a content property because those were the names attached to the inputs in the form. So that's how we get hold of the user input. Now here we could add validation, but we won't do so for the moment. And instead I now wanna add this node data as a new node to my existing nodes. To do that, I'll first of all get hold of my existing nodes that might be stored in this nodes.json file already by calling getStoredNodes. And this is a function that must be imported from this data folder and then nodes in there. So I'm using one of the two utility functions defined in this data folder in the nodes.js file. Now, getStoredNodes actually returns a promise. So here I'll await it like this. And with that, I got my existing nodes that might have been stored before, because I of course don't want to lose them if I add a new one. Then I take my node data object here and I add a brand new property to it, an ID property, because I want to have a unique identifier for every node. And here I'll simply use the current date converted to an ISO string as an ID. Theoretically, it's not unique because two nodes could be added at exactly the same moment, but for this demo, it's good enough. So with that, we now got the node data, we got the existing nodes. Now we can create an updated nodes object by using the existing nodes and calling concat on it and concatenating this node data with the new node. And then this updated nodes object should be stored back into nodes.json. And that can be done with that second utility function, the store nodes function, which expects to receive the new nodes that should be stored. And therefore here we now call store nodes, which is also imported from the data folder from the nodes.js file. And to store nodes we pass our updated nodes. Now this also returns a promise. And I will await this promise because now there's one last thing we have to do in this action. And what would that be? Well, assuming that that all works, we thereafter might want to redirect the user. Actually, for this page, we don't need to redirect the user because we'll render a list of nodes right below this form here in the future. But on other pages, you might have a separate page for creating data, for creating notes or blog posts or whatever your website is about, and then another page for listing that data. Therefore, it is quite common that you want to redirect the user after doing something on the server, after a post request that was sent to the server. And hence here, you should return a value in your action function. And what you return here typically should be a response. It doesn't always have to be a response, but a typical use case is to return a response that redirects the user to a different page. And such a redirect response can be created with these by calling the redirect function, which is provided by Remix. So here I'm importing the redirect function from remix run node. This is a function that can be executed like this, and it will simply create a new response object that redirects the user. Here you then provide the path to which you want to redirect the user. And that's it. With that, we added this action that does extract the user data and then store that user data in a database, or in this case in a file, and then redirect the user to a different page or to the same page in this case. With all that done, if we save everything, that's already all we need. If we now open those developer tools again to see whether things work, and I then add test and test, and zoom out a bit here, and click add node, you see the page was reloaded here, and we got a request here with a 300 status code, which is that redirect that occurred. That's the request that led us to this new page that was loaded here. Now we can tell that the node was actually stored on the backend by the fact that we got no error and by taking a look at nodes.json. And in there you see this is the new node that was added with the content we entered in the form. So now we got a full stack app with some server-side code that is not executing on the browser side, but on the backend. Over the last minutes, we got started writing some backend code by handling the submission of this new node form here. Now we could add validation here, user input validation, and we will do that a little bit later, but for the moment, I instead want to make sure that we can also fetch the data which we're storing in this nodes.json file. Because submitting data is nice, but of course, we don't see that here in our application. And ultimately, we want to build an application users can use. So therefore, the next goal is to output a list of goals, and for that attached you find a new component, the nodelist.jsx file and a nodelist.css file, which you should also put into your app components folder. Because this again will not be a route, but instead a component we use in another component, in this case in another route component. If you take a look at this new nodelist component in this new nodelist.jsx file, you see that it expects to get a nodes prop, and then I map through all my props to then simply output some data about my nodes. For example, output the date, which is encoded in the ID of every node. Due to the logic we wrote here in this action, we're adding the date as an ID. And we're also outputting the title and the content. That's what I'm doing here. I'm also importing some styles from nodelist CSS in this nodelist.jsx file, and then I surface those links by exporting a links function. Therefore, we can now go back to nodes.jsx and there import this nodelist component and import those surfaced links as well. So I import nodelist from tilde components nodelist. And from that same file, I also import those links and I give it an alias of nodelistlinks. By the way, now you also see why I'm using aliases here, because the function, which is exported by those component files, is always called links, and therefore we would have a name clash if we wouldn't assign aliases. Now I just need to add those links exported by this component file to the links made available by this route, and therefore in the links function of this route, I just also spread my node list links into this array like that. So now this route, when it's loaded, will load all the CSS files that are needed for all the components that we use in this route component. Speaking of that, I of course want to use this node list component, and here my idea simply is that I output my node list below my new node, like this. However, this node list component, of course, as mentioned, needs a nodes prop. It needs to get some nodes that should be output, and that's the part where we now need to fetch data. We need to fetch that data from this nodes.json file, and that again means we'll write some backend code, because reaching out to a data source, like a database, or in this case this file, is a backend task. This file is also stored on the backend, by the way. It's not downloaded to our users, it's on the backend, on our server. So therefore, in the nodes route, we have to add more backend code, but this time it's not an action. Because now I don't want to act upon some form submission, but instead I want to load the data whenever this component is loaded, whenever a GET request reaches this route. And that's achieved by exporting another function here, the loader function, like this. Loader, like action, is a reserved name, just like links. And Remix will be looking for such a function, hence we also must export it, so that Remix can find it in this file. And loader will be triggered by Remix, will be called by Remix, whenever a GET request reaches this route, which basically means whenever we want to view this page, whenever this component is about to be rendered. And keep in mind, the component will be pre-rendered on the server. On the server, it will be rendered and the finished HTML code is sent to the client then. along with some JavaScript code so that we still have an interactive website for the end user, but it's prepared and pre-rendered on the server. Therefore, it's now in this loader where we now write more backend code. Because just like the code in the action, code in the loader will be executed on the backend only. It will never reach the frontend, never reach the client side. Here I want to call getStoredNodes, which is another function we import from data nodes. Actually, we are already importing it because we already used it here in the action as well. I'll use it again here, and getStoredNodes returns a promise, so I'll turn my loader into an async function. Just like the action, it can be async or not async. Here we need it to be async because I want to use the await keyword to get my nodes, which are stored in the nodes.json file. And then here, that's actually all. I don't need to do anything else. I just want to retrieve my nodes. And now I need to pass them to this component because I want to output my nodes there. And how does this work? Well, that's again the part where Remix makes sure that these different ends and components and building blocks work together. In our loader, we can simply return the data that should be made available to the component. So to this component in this case. Now, technically, the data you return here in this loader is sent to the front end. Or to be very precise, this component, this nodes page component here, can be rendered on the server side if it's the first request to this page by a given visitor, for example. Thereafter, the visitor gets a single page application in which he or she navigates around. But for the first request, this is rendered on the server side. And therefore, this component function might also actually be executed on the server side. But if a user is already on our website and navigates around there and is therefore in this single page application environment which Remix creates for them, then Remix will just send requests to the backend behind the scenes to fetch some new data, and it will then call your loaders on the backend because that code always runs on the backend, and it will send these requests to that backend to that loader behind the scenes. Now, I'm stressing this, I'm emphasizing this, because this means that the data returned by the loader sometimes needs to be sent from the backend to the frontend. So there must be a response sent from the backend to the frontend. And indeed, that's what Remix does behind the scenes. It wraps this data into a response. Now, you can also do this yourselves. You can return a new response using the standard response constructor function, the standard response class that's built into Node.js. So this is not a Remix feature. And you could pass your data to this response. You could JSON stringify some data, like your nodes, because that data must be converted to JSON format. And you could then add a second value, a second argument to this response constructor function to add some extra headers so that you, for example, can set the content type header and set this to application JSON. That's an alternative to sending back the data like this. And that's in the end what Remix does under the hood, though of course this approach, where you just return the nodes, is much shorter. But there also is a shorter alternative to what I just showed you in cases where you still wanna send back a response manually. Remix offers a JSON function which must be imported from Remix run node, and that JSON function actually takes your raw data and converts it to a JSON response behind the scenes, setting that content type header behind the scenes as well, for example. So this also returns a response instead of the raw data, but it's an easier way of returning such a JSON response. And indeed, that is what Remix will do behind the scenes if you just return raw data like this. Now here I'll stick to returning raw data, and I won't use this JSON function, but I wanted to show this alternative to you because it is important to understand what Remix does behind the scenes and what you could instead of returning the raw data. But here, I'll simply return my nodes. I return my nodes here, and in this component, we now get access to these nodes here, to the data returned by the loader, by using a special hook provided by Remix, the useLoaderData hook. This hook is imported from Remix run React, And this hook simply gives us access to the data returned by the loader. Now, very important, the data returned here is serialized. It's temporarily converted to a JSON string, so you can't return any rich objects here. I mean, you can, but any methods or anything like that will get lost. You just get the plain data. And that's what you get here with useLoader data. So here I get my nodes, my array of nodes. And in this case, nothing will be lost because my nodes are just a bunch of strings in the end, and that is perfectly serializable. And then the nodes here can be passed to the nodes prop of the node list component like this. And that is all we have to do to load data for this component. And this loader, as mentioned, will be executed whenever a user visits this page. If we already visited another page and we then click a link so that we're redirected to this page, Remix will behind the scenes execute the loader on the server and make the data available on the front end. We don't have to worry about anything regarding that, and we don't have to send our own request to a backend or do anything like this. Instead, that's one of the advantages of Remix. It seamlessly blends frontend and backend together. If we save this and we go back, we should therefore see this first node here below this input. And I'll zoom out a bit so that we can see it a bit better. Here's this node. It's not clickable, I just have this animation here, but this is the node we added before. Now what's interesting is that if I add a new node, a second node, Remix is awesome, and I submit this, it will appear here automatically. So Remix takes care about automatically loading this when we revisit this page, because that's exactly the idea behind loaders. The loader gets executed basically whenever it needs to execute to ensure that this page always shows the latest data. Now we added the loader, and therefore we're now not just able to handle form submission, but also to load data. And you might wonder, how exactly do we now show a loading spinner on the front end whilst the data is being loaded? And the important answer is we don't. Instead, Remix only serves the finished page once the data has been loaded. So if I, for example, am on the starting page, and I then click on my nodes, this looks instantly, but behind the scenes, Remix ensured that the data was loaded before it loaded this page. And you can again see this if you open the developer tools and the network tab. If I click on my nodes, you see here, behind the scenes, this is the request where the nodes data was fetched. This request here is a GET request triggered by Remix behind the scenes, sent to a URL controlled by Remix behind the scenes, and it contains the nodes data, which is then rendered on the screen. So Remix takes care that all the data is loaded when it's needed. We don't have to worry about that, as mentioned. So at this point, we're able to submit data and load data and execute the respective backend code, and therefore we're able to perform the two most important backend tasks you have in almost any full stack app you're building. I now want to come back to this action again though and take a closer look at this form submission, at user validation, and some related aspects that are important to understand and know. And for that, let's go back here and add a third node. This is another node on Remix. Now I want you to watch this refresh icon again. If I click Add Node, you see it briefly turned to a cross. So what happened is that a new HTTP request was sent and a new page was returned by Remix in the end. This should make some sense because we are redirecting here at the end of the action. So we are redirecting to a new page, which is the same page as before, but technically it's a new request sent by the browser due to this redirect response we're sending back. So everything's working as intended, but of course, it would also make sense to stay in the single page application world here. If we are on this page and I add a new node and I submit the node, it would make sense to not send a new request that fetches a new page, because that means that we also re-download all the JavaScript code. Sure, it might be cached, but we still trigger a new download request for all the JavaScript code, and we execute all that JavaScript code that's used on the client side again. And we might want to avoid this if we're already on the page. To achieve this, we can go back to our form and replace this default form element, which generally worked fine as you saw, with another form component, which starts with a capital F and which must be imported from remix run React. Of course, we also must replace the closing tag. Now this form still renders a form as before, and you can still add those attributes which you can add to the normal form element. But it behaves slightly differently. If we save everything here, and I add a fourth node, another node, and you watch this refresh icon again, you see now it did not spin, and yet the data was submitted and the loader was triggered, even though we technically did not reload this page. We can also tell that the page wasn't reloaded because the inputs weren't cleared. Now still, the loader was triggered because, as I mentioned before, Remix automatically does the thing you would expect to happen. Now, with this special form component being used here instead of the default form, we stay in the single page application world, and Remix actually prevents the page from being reloaded, but it still behind the scenes sends a request to the backend and triggers this action, so to say. It still performs all this code, and it still notices that we want to redirect to the nodes page, but it does this with client-side routing thereafter, instead of triggering a new request that would actually fetch a new page. And it triggers the loader again, because it understands that we triggered an action and the data might have changed, and it should therefore fetch the updated data. As always, you can see that if you go to the network tab, and we add a fifth node here, you see, we got some requests here, no 300 request anymore, so no redirect request, but a post request, which includes the form data that we submitted under payload. And then thereafter, another request, a GET request, which in the end triggered that loader, so which gave us the updated data. And that's what Remix does for you. Again, blending backend and frontend while keeping the backend code on the backend. And therefore, typically, you want to use this form component provided by Remix instead of the default form element, so that you stay in this single page world. It's not bad if you use the default form, but with that we avoid the extra request. However, this form component really shines if we then use more extra features provided by Remix. Now, how can we leverage this form component besides going back to the single page application experience? Well, we could, for example, disable this button whilst the data is submitted. That is something you might want to do on forms. You want to make sure that it's not accidentally submitted twice. And you can easily do that when using this form component provided by Remix by also using another hook. And that's the use navigation hook. Actually, at the point of time I'm recording this, it's called use transition, but it will be renamed to use navigation in a future version, because use transition is a hook that's now also provided by React itself. Therefore, here I'll give it an alias, and you should simply check whether you have a use navigation hook you could import, which you can tell by the fact that you get autocompletion, which I don't get here for a use navigation. If you get autocompletion for a use transition, I recommend that you also rename it to use navigation so that you already get used to that new name, which this hook will have in the future. Now, this hook gives us a navigation object, if we call it. And this navigation object contains some useful data about ongoing requests that might be happening behind the scenes, so to say. For example, we can access the state property to find out whether we're currently submitting data, or if we're maybe loading data, or if we're not doing anything. We can also access the submission property to get more information about the latest form submission that was triggered. Like, for example, the path to which the request was sent, what the method was, or which kind of data was submitted. You can also use the type here to find out whether the last navigation that was performed by Remix behind the scenes, so to say, was maybe that you were redirected because of some action that was called. And here I'm interested in the state. I want to check if we're currently submitting, and I'll store the result in a isSubmitting constant. And now I can use this constant to disable this button by simply binding the disabled prop, or setting the disabled prop here to isSubmitting. If I am submitting, I want to disable this button. We can also change the label of this button and check if we are submitting, in which case we could say adding ... and otherwise we say add node. So we can take the current submission status into account. Now here we won't really see this because this will be super fast since it's all running locally. But if you would add a new node here and your backend would be slightly slower, you would see that temporarily this button is disabled and its label changes. Again, here it's just too fast since it's all happening on the same machine. We can see it in action though by awaiting a new promise which I construct here, where I will simply wrap a call to set timeout, and then when the timeout is done, simply call resolve and set the timeout to 2 seconds like this. With this line added, we'll simply add a 2-second pause here. And if we do that, and I add another node, you will see that now this is disabled and shows adding until it's done. Now, of course, I'll comment this out since I don't want this pause anymore, but that is how you can also leverage this form component to get this extra information and to enhance the user interface based on the current submission status. So that was the use navigation hook and this form component, which you don't have to use in conjunction, but which allow you to enhance the user interface if you do so. You can't use navigation with the regular form because there a new request gets sent and the page is simply reloaded instead of staying in that single page application world. You only do that with this form with a capital F. However, that's not all we can do with this action and the form data. Instead, now I also want to validate the submitted data. Not some super complex validation, but at least some validation. And for this here, we could check if in that node data which we get, so that form data that was submitted, if there the title, if we trim it to remove white space at the beginning and end, if that has at least a length of, let's say, 5 characters to enforce a title length of 5 characters. We could also add validation for the content, but here I want to keep it simple, so I'll just validate the title for this minimum length. Now, if this is not met, so actually I want to check whether it's smaller than 5, so if it's shorter than 5 characters, if that's the case, if we have an invalid title, if it's too short, shorter than 5 characters, then we might want to show an error message to the user. Now you could think about calling the default alert function, which is offered by browsers. However, this wouldn't work here because keep in mind that this code runs on the backend, on a server, not in the browser. So you can't use browser APIs here. You can't use browser-only features here. What we can and should do instead is that we return a value here. We do return a redirect here at the end of the action. Here I want to return a different value. And what would that value be that I return here? Well, that's up to you, just as you can return any kind of data from a loader. Here, for example, we could return a message where we say invalid title must be at least 5 characters long, something like this. So actions, like loaders, can also return data, not just redirect responses. That's the typical thing you do at the end of a successful action, but you can also return data. But how do you get hold of that data? How do you get access to that data? Well, for that there's another hook which you can use, and that's the useActionData hook. This hook, like useLoaderData, gives you access to the data, in this case returned by an action. So useActionData gives you access to the data returned by an action. useLoaderData gives you access to the data returned by a loader. Use action data also must be imported from Remix Run React. Now this data can again be anything. In our case, it's an object with a message property. And we can now use that to output the error message. We could, for example, pass it to new node as a prop, and then in the new node component, we could output this error. Maybe here above the form or here inside the form. Here at the top, we could add a paragraph where we output the error message. We could, as I mentioned, pass down this data via a prop to new node, but we don't have to. Instead, we can remove the use action data hook from this nodes page, so from this route component, and remove this import, and instead call it in this new node component itself. Because that's also important. Use action data and also use loader data cannot just be called in these route components, but in any components. And they will get the action or loader data of the closest loader or action that was called. So if I use loader data or use action data in the new node component, and this component was rendered by this page, I will get access to the data returned by the loader or the action of that page. So therefore here in the new node JSX file, I can access use action data, get my data, and of course import that hook from Remix Run React. And now we can leverage that data to output our error. For that, I'll output this paragraph conditionally. And first of all, check whether data exists. And if it does, whether it has a message. If that's the case, I will output data.message here. If that's not the case, I won't output anything. And this is all default JavaScript JSX code. If we save that and we go back here and I enter test, which is too short, and something here, which doesn't matter, and I click add node, I get my error message here. As expected, due to use action data. If I add test node instead, which is long enough, it is added correctly and the message disappears because the action data is cleared thereafter, because the action was called again and succeeded this time and returned a redirect instead of my error data. But it is important to understand that actions can also return data, that you can get hold of that data with use action data, and that use action data, just like use loader data, can be called in any component. At this point, we already made good progress and we're almost done for this essentials section. However, there are still a couple of crucial features that are missing, and one of them is error handling, because things can go wrong. Here, for example, in our action, the file or the database where we're storing data could temporarily be unavailable or overwhelmed or anything like this. So saving the data could fail. And of course, reading the data could also fail. Now, to simulate this, we could delete this file here, but here I'll not delete it, I'll just rename it so that it's not found anymore. I deleted the n here at the end of the extension, and therefore this file, this nodes.json file for which we're looking, does not exist anymore. Therefore now if we save this and I reload, I get this ugly error page because our server essentially crashed. Or we got an error at least, and this default error page is being shown. Now typically you don't want to use that default error page, instead you want to show your own error page, and you can easily do that with Remix. For example, we can go to this root component, and in there we can export another new function. And that function is called error boundary like this. And it's actually a component which we're exporting here. Therefore, it starts with an uppercase E. This is a special function, a special component though, which must be named like this because just like links and action and so on, Remix will be looking for this. This is a component Remix will display if an error occurs anywhere in your application. So on any page, since I'm doing this in the root component here. I will soon show you how you can add it to other pages as well, but here we'll do it in a root component. Now in there, I now want to return my HTML skeleton, so I'll grab that, but I'll adjust it a little bit. For example, I'll add a title here, which we can do. We can add any default HTML elements here in this skeleton. And here I'll add a title to head and say an error occurred. And then here I still output my main navigation maybe, but instead of the outlet, I'll output a main section here where I have a h1 element with a text of an error occurred. And then below that, maybe the error message. Now this special component always gets an error prop, which we can get hold of with object destructuring like this. And this prop will be provided, or a value for this prop will be provided by Remix, because Remix will create this component when an error occurs. This is the default JavaScript error object, so the value here on this error prop is an object based on this default JavaScript error object constructor, and therefore we'll have a message property which we can access here. We could then also add some extra text which maybe says back to safety, and safety should maybe be wrapped by the link component. So this default Remix link component, which therefore also must be imported from Remix Run React. And here I simply want to go back to the starting page. With that, if we save this and we reload, I get my own error page here, as you can tell. Now the styling is a bit off, but it can be fixed by adding a special class to main here, the error class, for which I define some styles in one of the style files I provided earlier. With that, I got this error look here. And I can, of course, go back to safety, but whenever I go back to notes, it crashes again. So that's how you can add your own error page, your own error component, with help of this error boundary. However, you're not limited to just adding this to the root component. Instead, you can add this special error boundary component in any route file. If you only have it in the root component, this will simply handle all errors that occur anywhere. So it's the last resort of error catching, so to say. But if we know that things could go wrong on our nodes route here, it might make sense to add a separate error boundary here. And then here we could return some content that's tailored for this specific page. And actually what's then important to keep in mind and to understand is that if you have an error boundary on a route that's not the root route, only the content of that route, which failed, will be replaced by the error boundary. So only this page content will be replaced. So if I have an error boundary here in nodes.jsx, this content returned by this error boundary component will be injected in my default skeleton here in place of the outlet. So therefore now with that, I could copy this part here and just this part of my root error outlet and add it here and return it as part of this error boundary. We now just need to make sure that we again use this error prop, which we're getting automatically. I now also must import link here from Remix Run React again. And with that added, we get the same output as before, but technically what happens under the hood is different now. Because now we're actually using this error boundary. And therefore we could also tailor this more for this specific scenario and, for example, replace an error occurred with an error related to your nodes occurred, whatever you want. And now you will see that this error boundary is being used because you see this message here. So that's how you can handle errors and how easy it is to handle errors. You don't have to manage any error state in your component and check if there is an error or anything like this. You simply define this fallback component and it will automatically be rendered whenever an error occurs in this route, or in case of the root component here, the root route, anywhere in the application. Now, error boundary is super important and helpful for, well, handling errors, but it actually only deals with normal errors. But there is another kind of error that could occur in case of a full stack application. You could have an error response that's being generated by the backend. And to show you what the difference is, let me actually generate an error response. For that, back here in nodes.jsx, we could say that we maybe want to generate some error response if we don't find any nodes yet. We could check if maybe not nodes, or if nodes.length is equal to 0, which means we have no nodes yet. And in that case, I don't want to return this empty array, but instead I want to generate an error response, maybe a 404 response, because no nodes were found. And generating such an error response in Remix is super simple. You don't use return, but instead the throw keyword, and then you don't throw any random data, but instead a response, which you can create by instantiating the built-in response object, which is supported by Node.js and the browser, or by using a shortcut and using the JSON function, which is imported like the redirect function from Remix run node. And this JSON function simply generates a response object which contains some JSON data. Now, the first argument to this JSON function is the data that should be included in the response. And here that could be an object with a message of could not find any nodes, for example. The second argument you pass to this JSON function allows you to configure this response in greater detail. For example, you can add a status code. And here we could set it to 404 to make it clear which kind of response it is, which kind of error we have here. You can also add a status text, which could say not found or anything like this. Now, whenever you throw a response, Remix recognizes this and renders a different component than the error boundary. Whenever you throw anything but a response, like some text or a regular object, the error boundary will be used. Whenever you return, the default page component will be used. And whenever you throw a response, like a response generated with this JSON helper function, another component will be rendered. A component which you also should export here in your route to which it belongs, and a component that's called catch boundary, because this catches any error responses. And just like error boundary, you can add it on a per route level, or add it on the root level, or do both. The root level catch boundary will catch all unhandled error responses that were generated anywhere else in the application. And the route specific catch boundary will handle any error responses related to this route here. And here we could then return, again, a main block where we simply output a paragraph where we then might want to output the message that's attached to this error response. To get hold of that data, we can use another special hook provided by Remix, the useCatch hook, which of course must be imported from Remix run React in this case. Now this useCatch hook here gives us an object, the caught response to be precise, so this error response that was generated, or to be precise, an object based on that error response. And on that object, we can get hold of the status code, the status text, and the data that's part of the response. So basically the kind of things we passed to this JSON function, right? There I passed some content, a status and a status text, and that's exactly what we can extract with help of that data returned by useCatch. So here we could then access the data and get hold of the message property if data exists. And if the message property or data is undefined, we could simply use some generic fallback message like data not found, and then store that in a message constant and output this here in our returned value. And this component will now be rendered by Remix whenever we have an error response being thrown by an action or a loader related to this route. If we now save this, and I fix the nodes.json file name again, and I now delete all the nodes from this file so that we have no nodes. And we then save everything again. If we reload, we see this could not find any nodes error message, which is that message we attached to this error response we're throwing here. Now, styling is not great, but we can easily fix this by adding a special class to this paragraph, the info-message class, which is also defined in one of the CSS files. And with that, it looks a lot better. Of course, here we now have the problem that we can't add any nodes anymore because, well, our form is gone. And therefore here in this component, in this catch boundary component, we also might want to output the new node form so that we still can add new nodes, like a new node here. And this then still works as before, but now we also got this error response handling here. And this error response handling can also be used in the root route again to return some generic skeleton for all error responses that are not handled anywhere else. And most importantly, also for the scenario that users entered an invalid URL here. Because in that case, if I, for example, try to visit localhost 3000/abc, Remix will automatically generate an error response. However, we then also have to handle that error response. And for that, we can also use catch here in this catch boundary in the root.js file. And of course, import use catch from remix run React. Then get hold of that caught response. And then maybe use the caught response status text as a title here and as a title here. And check if we have a caught response.data message. And otherwise, just output something generic like an error occurred or something went wrong. That is something we could output here. With that, we also have this catch boundary in the root.js file. And now if I try to visit a page that's not supported, I see this page here because of this catch boundary we just added. So now we can add nodes, we can handle errors, and this overall application is taking shape, and we also already learned quite a bit about Remix. One crucial feature is missing, which definitely also must be covered in this essentials section here. And that would be dynamic routes. Now, what are dynamic routes though? At the moment, we have two routes. And now let's say we want to make these nodes clickable and we want to show these node details in some full screen mode if we do click them. So then we need a new route that shows us these node details. And of course, it would be one and the same route and one and the same component, one and the same page for all the nodes, but the content would be different because if we have multiple nodes, like Remix is awesome as a second node, it really is. Then of course, if I click this node, I want to see the details of this node on the full screen page. And if I click the first node, I want to see those details. So one route, but with different content. And that's exactly what a dynamic route is. Now we add such a dynamic route by adding a new file to the routes folder and giving it a special file name. A file name that starts with a $sign. And here that could be node id.jsx, for example, though the part after the $sign is up to you. It could also be just ID or node or whatever you want. But here I'll go for node ID. The $sign in front of node ID signals to Remix that this is a dynamic route. And a dynamic route simply means that the actual value in the path will not be $sign node ID, but instead that only acts as a placeholder for the actual value that will later be encoded in the URL. And you probably already know this concept of dynamic routes from React Router, Express.js, or a lot of other routing libraries as well. Now here in this $sign node id.jsx file, we again should export a default function, maybe called node details page. Name, of course, is up to you, as you know. And there I want to return some markup. I want to return a main element with an ID of node-details, which then includes a header maybe, and in there a nav element where I simply have a link imported from remix run React, which points back to /nodes, so to that overview page where we add nodes and see that list of nodes. And we could give this link a label of back to all nodes. And then below this nav element here, I have a h1 element where I want to output the node title. So this should actually be dynamic. It will be replaced soon. And below the header, I want to have a paragraph with an ID of node-details-content, and then here the node content. Now, these IDs are important for styling purposes, because attached you also find a node detail.css file, which you should move into your styles folder. And then in the node ID.jsx file, the $ node ID.jsx file, you import that CSS file, like this, for example, and then export this special links function you already learned about earlier, where we have one style sheet link which simply loads those imported styles, so that we do load these page-specific styles. Now this is my node details page, but of course the data is missing. Now, before we add the missing data, let's make sure that we can reach this page. And we can reach it already, since it is a registered route, by going to our website and, for example, entering node-1. So not nodes, but node-1. Instead of getting a 404 error, we now see this nodes detail page, because that's what dynamic routes are all about. This value, node-1, is now interpreted by Remix as a value for this node ID placeholder. And it's this $sign that tells Remix that this is a placeholder. So whatever we enter here, including ABC, is now treated as a value for this node ID. We can still enter /nodes. Remix is smart enough to understand that there is a dedicated route for the path nodes, but basically anything else is treated as a value for this node ID. So that's how we can register such a dynamic route. To also go there dynamically, we can go to the node list.jsx element and wrap this article with the link component, which is imported from Remix Run React. Move the closing tag here. And then the to-prop of this link points to the node ID for which we want to load this detail page. Here, this means that I'll set this to a dynamic value, and I'll use node ID as a value. Out of the box, the link component supports relative paths here for the to-prop, which means if I enter something like node1 here, this is automatically appended after the currently active path. If I add a slash at the beginning, it would instead be an absolute path, which in this case would be the same, but it can be useful for easily constructing longer paths by just adding some new fragment here and letting the link and remix automatically append it to the currently active path. And here that's what we'll do with node ID. It's simply appended to the currently active path. Which means that if I save this, if I click this, it tries to go to /nodes. And then this ID, because as I mentioned, it adds it to the currently active path. And since I am on /nodes here, it adds the ID after this. Now, since this doesn't lead us to the node, we have two options. We rename this file to make sure that it does start with /nodes, or we change our link here and convert it to an absolute path. For example, like this, by adding a / at the beginning. However, here I rather rename this route name. We can do this and add a leading /nodes in front of this dynamic segment by adding nodes dot in front of this $sign node ID part. This might look a bit strange, but is valid code when using remix.js. This simply tells Remix that this route here should be loaded if the path is /nodes / some dynamic segment. So by changing this file name like this, we see that now we do load this node detail page for /nodes / the ID of that node, And if on the other hand I try to visit localhost 3000/node1, I get my 404 page again, basically. So that's how we can load the node detail page and how dynamic routes work in general with Remix. How can we now also load the data that's required by that page though? To load the data for the node details page, we bring back another function which we saw before already, the loader function, because that's the function you need to load data for a component on the backend, which is what we want to do here. Again, Remix will execute this automatically when we try to load this page, and in here we now want to reach out to our nodes.json file and fetch the right node for this website here, for this page here, I mean. For this, I use this getStoredNodes helper function, which is imported from data nodes, so from this nodes.js file here in the data folder. And as you learned before, this returns a promise, so I will use async await here. And then we get our nodes. But here, of course, we get all nodes. Now, if this would be a real database, there would probably be a dedicated function for just fetching a single entry from the database. Here, I'm instead fetching all entries from that file. And now I want to find the selected node by going to my nodes, and I can use the find method, a default JavaScript method that exists on arrays, to find the node where the ID is equal to the ID that's part of the URL here. But how do we get hold of that ID in that loader? Well, just like the action function, this loader function also receives a data object passed in by Remix automatically. And this object also has a request property with details about the GET request. But more importantly for us here, it also has a params property with information about the dynamic route parameters. So these dynamic path segments like this ID here. So basically, if you have a $sign here in the route file name, it's the part after the $sign that's part of this params object. This placeholder can be used for accessing the actual value that's stored for this placeholder in the URL. By the way, this params object is also available in an action if you would need it there. Here we don't, but if you had an action that also runs for a page that has some dynamic path segment, you would get access to the params object here on actions as well. But here we need it for the loader. I'm using object destructuring for getting hold of this params object. And then here, I know that my node ID can be found on params.nodeID. And it's node ID here because I chose node ID here after the $sign. If you chose a different identifier after the $sign, you must use a different identifier here as well. For me, it's node ID though, and therefore here in this check down there, I check whether I find a node which has an ID that is equal to that node ID that's part of my URL. And then I try to return that node and store it in this constant. Therefore then I can return this selected node in my loader. And in the node details page, we again get access to that data with use loader data, which is imported from Remix Run React. So here I get my node. And now we can output the node title by accessing node.title, just like that. And the content by accessing node.content, like that. And with that, if we reload, you see I have some concrete data here. If I click on the second node with Remix is awesome, I see that here as well. So that's how we can fetch dynamic data for dynamic routes that have dynamic values in the URL. Now, when we're loading data for this dynamic route here, we could of course have the scenario that a user tries to access this page for a node ID that doesn't exist. In that case here, our default error handler becomes active. But we might want to handle this on our own here because this is quite a common scenario. It's quite easy to imagine that we have this problem. Therefore here in the loader of this dynamic route, we can check if selected node is not defined, if it's falsy, which means we haven't found this node for this ID. And in that case, we could throw an error response with help of that utility helper JSON function imported from remix run node. And there we could add an object with a message of could not find node for ID, and then maybe repeat that node ID which the user tried to access, and give it a status code of 404 again. So now again, we're throwing an error response, and as you learned before, this will trigger the catch boundary. Either a catch boundary we add to this route, but if we don't do this, then the root catch boundary. So here I won't add a dedicated catch boundary, and instead I now get this default error handler, this default catch boundary from the root component. After all these crucial core features, finally to conclude this section and to come to an end, there's one last essential feature you also should know about. And that would be metadata and how you can add metadata to your pages. But to be clear, what exactly do I mean by metadata? Well, I for example mean that title, which shows up here in the tab bar, or which also shows up in Google search results. And I also mean this description, which shows up here, and a bunch of other metadata you might want to add to your pages. Adding such metadata to pages with Remix is again quite straightforward and simple. All you have to do, for example here in nodes.js, is export another new function. And by the way, it does not matter where in this file you export the function. The order does not matter. So here, maybe after the links function, I'll export another function which is called meta. And you might have seen this function before. In that root.js file, there actually also is such a meta function already. Now, meta is a function that should return a JavaScript object. And on this object, you can set various metadata fields. Now, you'll learn a bit more about the available fields and how meta works in the official documentation. But you can, for example, add the title field to set the title for a page. The title that will show up as a title in your search results and also in the tab bar title, for example. And here, that could, for example, be all notes for this notes page. We can also add a description here. And that could be manage your notes with ease, anything like this. Now, the metadata you set up on a page will be merged with any higher level page metadata you might have defined. For example, in the root page, we also have a meta function, and the data defined here, the metadata defined here, would be merged with metadata defined in one of the other pages, since they are wrapped by the root page, as you learned before. If we have clashes like this title here, which is defined both in the metadata of nodes.js and root.js, the lower level page wins. So the more specific metadata definition wins. The metadata definition of this page here wins over the generic root metadata. And that is how you can add your metadata. If you again save this, you will notice that for this all nodes page, the title here now says all nodes, instead of new remix app, which it says on other pages. We can also add metadata by copying this function to keep things simple to this dynamic route here. And there we of course might want to access some dynamic data. For example, the title here should probably be the title of the node that's being displayed. This is again pretty easy to do because, like many other functions, the meta function automatically receives a data object provided by Remix, and that object, for example, has a data property. So now this is not the overall data object, but a property in that object that's provided by Remix that's called data. And this data property holds the data that is returned by your loader. So in this case, the node which we selected, this is what we receive here on this data property in this meta function. And therefore here we can of course set the title to data.title, since we know that for this component, for this route, data will simply be a node because that is what our loader returns here. You could, for example, also access params here if you would need access to the params themselves. But here I'm just interested in the final data. And with that, I'm setting the title of a specific node as a page title. And therefore, if we visit one of these nodes, you see that this page title is adjusted appropriately. Here it's Remix is awesome, and for the other node, it's new nodes. And that's how you can add metadata to your pages. Now, with all these features covered, you now know all these crucial features, the core concepts that make up Remix and that make Remix awesome. You can see how easy it is to build full-stack applications, full-stack websites, and blend backend and frontend with Remix. Now, obviously, Remix has way more to offer, and we dive into more Remix features in the full course. We'll explore more features related to routing, to data fetching. We'll explore user authentication, which is actually also easy to implement with Remix, but here in this section, we learned about the core concepts you must know. You learned how routing generally works with these files in the special routes folder. You learned about dynamic routes. You learned about submitting data and handling data submissions with actions, how you can return responses or data from actions. You learned about data fetching with loaders and how that data is exposed to your components with useLoaderData, or useActionData in case of the action function, and that you can use useActionData and useLoaderData in any component, and it will get the closest action or loader data. You learned about this special form component and that you can update the UI based on the current data submission status. You learned about error handling and how you can throw error responses to trigger a catch boundary or throw regular errors to trigger an error boundary, and that catch and error boundaries can be added to any route and/or the root route as a last resort catch or error boundary, so to say. You learned about styling and this special links function and how you can surface styles from components to the routes where those components are used. And you therefore now have all the core features you need to get started building your own first Remix applications. As mentioned, we'll dive much deeper in the full course, but you now got the solid foundation you need to dive deeper into Remix.